Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. My name is Jonathan Davids. Thank you very much for joining. I'm DriverCheck's Corporate Medical Director and an occupational medicine physician and a MRO. Just want to talk a little bit about who DriverCheck is for those of you who are new to us. DriverCheck was established in 1996 and since then has been working with clients to provide a whole suite of occupational health services and drug and alcohol testing to over 6,000 clients across Canada. We certainly serve clients in the transportation sector, including ground, rail, and aviation, the oil and gas sector, manufacturing, mining, construction, just to name a few. We, of course, also have a very special relationship with the Canadian trucking industry and the U.S. Department of Transportation, or DOT, as the DOT regulations for drug and alcohol testing of truck drivers crossing over the U.S. border were the initial spark that launched DriverCheck over 27 years ago. So back to the topic at hand, oral fluid. Oral fluid testing has been talked about a lot recently, especially in the DOT space, but of course in all safety-sensitive industries. For decades, urine drug testing has been the standard for toxicological testing for drugs and abuse, for drugs of abuse and illicit substances. Certainly, if an illicit substance was detected in urine, it was sufficient for employers to restrict or prohibit individuals from certain types of safety-sensitive work, but public perception and laws have changed recently to allow recreational use of cannabis, which once was illicit but is now legal. This has posed problems with urine drug testing because cannabis can be detected in urine for days to weeks after use, well after the acute intoxication effects have worn off in most users. Oral fluid testing offers a solution to this and in many ways also offers additional advantages over urine drug screening. Now in Canada, employers who aren't regulated by the US DOT have been using oral fluid testing for quite some time now, and in a lot of ways we're further along the path of moving from urine drug testing to adopting oral fluid testing as the go-to solution. Today's webinar will focus on the changed DOT regulations that now allow oral fluid to be used as a testing option for DOT-regulated employers, but we'll also go over all the advantages of oral fluid testing, whether or not your organization is DOT regulated. We'll also attempt to answer the question of whether oral fluid testing is right for your organization. Now, to help me with this, I've got two wonderful speakers joining us. First, we're going to hear from Brandon Kearse, who's DriverCheck's Privacy and Compliance Coordinator, and a little bit more about him in just a minute. Brandon will be updating us on the current landscape of DOT and oral fluid testing. And then we'll hear from Dr. Melissa Snyder-Adler, DriverCheck's Chief Medical Review Officer, who will be taking us through insights into oral fluid testing and comparisons with other testing methods, mainly urine, and will give us some insights into the accuracy of this and more. So just a bit of housekeeping before we get into this. At the end of the webinar, I will be hosting a Q&A. So throughout our speakers' presentations, please put your questions into the Q&A function. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see the little bubbles over there. If you could type that in as we go along, we will try to answer as many of the questions that come to us as we possibly can. We will also be posting this webinar online shortly after we finish in the next few days, so keep your eyes out for that as well. Okay, so without further delay, let me introduce Brandon Kearse to you. Brandon has been with DriverCheck now for over 5 years, with the majority of that time focusing on the ins and outs of DOT regulations. Prior to DC, he's worked with other major travel companies like Greyhound, managing driver safety, driver training, and drug and alcohol testing. So Brandon is a perfect person to kick off this webinar and give us a clear picture of DOT regulations as it pertains to oral fluid testing. Brandon, over to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Dr. Davids. And like you stated, oral fluid testing is quite a relevant topic right now, so I'm going to get right into it. And again, my focus is going to be on DOT oral fluid. And for those of you who don't do DOT testing, I'm only going to be about 10 minutes, but there might be some relevant things within what I'm going to say. So as you know, for many years, the United States Department of Transportation, the DOT, only allowed for the collection of urine specimens for drug testing purposes. Well, that's since changed. The DOT published its final rulemaking in May of 2023, and the final rule amends the regulated drug testing program to include oral fluid testing. And this additional methodology for drug testing will give employers a choice to help combat employee cheating on drug tests, and it also provides a less intrusive means of achieving the safety goals of the overall drug testing program. So the entire oral fluid collection can be conducted entirely in the presence of the collector and doesn't require a dedicated urination facility. Additionally, the DOT's final rule amends FAA, FMCSA, FRA, and FTA agency specific regulations to ensure consistency across the Department of Transportation. And it also removes or adjusts references to the word urine and adds references to the word oral fluid. So you might be asking yourself, what does this mean for me as a DOT regulated employer? Well, what it means for you is that you as the employer, not the employee, will choose the collection methodology for the test reason. So you might decide that your random program or your pre-employment testing will start with a urine collection, but your post-accident or follow-up testing might use oral fluid testing. The choice is going to be yours. And you'll need to remember that whatever you do for one employee, that's done for all others. You're going to apply your testing policies equitably and fairly. You can't limit oral fluid testing to just one particular employee and then do urine testing for everyone else. So as you're going to have a choice in the testing methodology for DOT purposes, the best practice is going to be have a standing order in place with DriverCheck so that we know what kind of collection you want performed, either urine or oral fluid, and when you want to perform it. And just to touch on that a bit further, DriverCheck will have a process in place to help you instruct us on what type of collection method you'd like to use and for which testing reasons. And this process is going to be available to DriverCheck clients closer to the time of when 2 laboratories have been certified to conduct DOT oral fluid testing. And I'm going to get into the whole laboratory bit in just a second. But essentially, oral fluid testing is a game changer for DOT regulated employers. Next slide, please. You might be asking yourself, can I start doing oral fluid testing? Well, the short answer is no. DOT oral fluid testing can't be implemented until the United States Department of Health and Human Services, sometimes called HHS, certifies at least 2 laboratories to analyze oral fluid specimens. One lab will serve as the primary specimen testing lab, and then the second laboratory will need to serve as the split specimen laboratory. And so in addition to 2 certified labs, there's going to have to be an oral fluid collection device that's approved for DOT purposes. And I'm probably going to bore you with this next part, but I have to explain some of the specifications and requirements of the DOT regulations regarding the oral fluid collection device, so it makes a bit more sense why this process is taking a long time. So the regulations require that the oral fluid collection device for DOT purposes can be subdivided in the employee's presence when testing. And so it can be split into a specimen A and a specimen B. The device must have unit markings or other indicators that demonstrate that the adequacy of volume for oral fluid has been collected. The device must also be sufficiently transparent to permit a visual assessment of the contents without opening the specimen bottle. The device must also be individually packaged in an easily visible tamper evident system. It must have the device's expiration date on the specimen bottles. That way, when it's sent to the laboratory is able to check whether or not the expiration date has passed. And the device must not have components that substantially affect the composition of the drugs or drug metabolites in the oral fluid specimen. And the device also can't interfere with any accurate analysis of the specimen itself. It also must maintain the integrity of the specimen during storage as well as transportation. That way it can be tested at the laboratory. And The device must be approved by HHS. That way it can be used by a specific HHS certified laboratory. So as you can tell from that long list of specifications, the oral fluid device um, must meet a lot of requirements to be approved for use for DOT purposes. But the one specification that really complicates things is that the laboratory certifications, the laboratory approval process is wholly dependent on an oral fluid collection device being approved first. They need to have that device first. That way, the laboratory can then begin testing and certification process using that particular device. And there's yet one more hurdle in addition to this. The US Food and Drug Administration, the US FDA, has to approve the oral fluid collection device. Uh, so there's yet another regulatory hurdle to be met. Now I'm going to switch gears slightly and briefly touch on what's called the custody and control form, or what some of us call the CCF, the chain of custody. You might be wondering, okay, is there going to be a new DOT CCF, or what's formerly called the United States Federal CCF? Well, that's already been implemented. They rolled that out a few years back, and the chain of custody includes a provision, like an option for oral fluid testing as well as urine testing. We haven't been able to use the oral fluid testing option yet, but it is on the newer chain of custody. So um, we DriverCheck made our clients aware of this when it was first rolled out a few years back, and we've been using it for some time now. So there really shouldn't be any impacts in regards to the custody and control form. And apart from this, you might be asking yourself whether you need to update your company's drug and alcohol policy, specifically if you have a DOT drug and alcohol testing policy, because oral fluid has been added to the regulations. Well, the DOT has advised that there's no need for employers to make any changes to their current policies. However, there are some exceptions to that. So specifically when the employer's policy states that urine is the only authorized specimen for drug testing, that would need to be updated to say that urine and/or oral fluid is authorized for drug testing purposes. Additionally, if your company will be authorizing oral fluid testing, the policy will need to be updated to state the reasons you'll be testing for, such as pre-employment or post-accident. And your policy will also need to state if oral fluid collections will be authorized for any unique situations, such as a shy bladder situation where somebody cannot provide enough urine during a urine collection, or during direct observation collections. And specific to direct observation collections involving any transgendered or non-binary individuals, oral fluid collection must be conducted. And just a little plug here for DriverCheck, and you might be aware of this already, but DriverCheck does sell a DOT drug and alcohol policy template, so that is available should you need it. So now for the question everybody's been asking, what's on everybody's mind? When do we anticipate DOT oral fluid testing to start happening? Well, not to disappoint any of you, but in speaking with our laboratories and industry associations, we don't expect to be collecting oral fluid specimens for DOT purposes until 2025 at the earliest. And this is in large part due to the time, the hurdles, the expense it takes for the oral fluid kit manufacturers to come up with a collection device that meets all of the specifications and the specifications in the regulations. And then for the laboratories to then go through the certification process. It's not an easy process, and it is a bit drawn out. There's several measures that have to be met first before this can go into place. And I know some of us are kind of chomping at the bit to start utilizing oral fluid testing, but the wait's going to be just a little bit longer. And what I suggest is you use this as an opportunity to think about when and how your company is going to use oral fluid testing for your drug and alcohol testing program. And that's it for me. I'm going to pass things back over to Dr. Davids.
Thanks very much, Brandon. That was great. Again, just as a reminder, if you do have any questions for Brandon, for Melissa, for us in general, if you put that down in the Q&A section, we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the show. I'd like to now introduce Dr. Melissa Snyder-Adler. Melissa is a Chief Medical Review Officer for DriverCheck and is also in private practice as an addiction medicine physician. She is the co-author of medical cannabis publications and delivers expert insights and education focused on workplace substance use and impairment, including prescription medications and medical cannabis. She's considered an expert in the field of substance use in the workplace and drug and alcohol testing for safety-sensitive workplaces. And she is a fan favorite. I keep calling her that with her speaking engagements. It is a pleasure to have Melissa speak on the subject of exploring oral fluid testing in transportation and other safety-sensitive industries. Melissa, over to you.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm just going to share my screen. And we are going to get started. So I'm just looking at my watch to be sure that I don't go over, because as most of you who've heard me speak will know, I like to talk and I can speak for a very long period of time. So we are really going to go through oral fluid. I want to talk about both DOT and non-DOT for those of you who have the option right now. From a non-DOT perspective of using oral fluid, we're going to compare them, as we said, and we're going to talk a little bit about point of collection oral fluid testing, POCT testing. All right, so just to begin with, from an advantage perspective for oral fluid, and this is in comparison to urine, there are many advantages. They are all observed testing. So, I know for DOT, there are some circumstances in which we would do observed testing, but for the most part, non-DOT, we don't do observed testing. And then there is the risk of adulteration, substitution, tampering with the test, and that happens. So with oral fluid testing, it is all observed. That I don't want to say it cuts out 100% the chance of any tampering, but it significantly reduces that, and we do have evidence of that when we look at test results comparing urine and oral fluid. We do not need any special requirements. Brandon touched on this as well. Nothing gender specific with respect to observed testing from a DOT perspective. It is generally quick and non-invasive. So I say generally because just like we can see shy bladder, we can sometimes see what we call dry mouth or shy mouth, depending on where you look. But generally 5 or 10 minutes in order to collect the proper amount. The oral fluid swab that we are using right now in Canada, non-DOT testing, has an indicator on it to identify when we've collected enough oral fluid, so you know how long it should be. It can be minutes, it can be 1 or 2 minutes, and it can be a little bit longer. One of the other advantages, which some people may see as a disadvantage, but for the most part in Canada with legalized cannabis, is that it is a significantly shorter detection window for THC. The other big one, which we don't often talk about, is cocaine. And I bring this up because in oral fluid, we can test for both cocaine and the metabolite of cocaine, and it provides us significantly more information with respect to time frame of use. Using both of those substances and the ratios between them and the levels, et cetera, it gives us a window that is a bit tighter than just with urine testing. For everything else, I want to say it's similar timeframes with a couple exceptions, but generally speaking, it's in and around the same. From a disadvantage perspective, dry mouth is one, but I would say we have shy bladder as well. I haven't seen more dry mouth than shy bladder. In fact, we probably have less dry mouth than we see shy bladder. However, substance use in the way of especially reasonable cause testing can lead to dry mouth. So now you have someone that you suspect of using substances causing dry mouth and you're trying to do an oral fluid swab, it may be challenging, but there are certain things that we can do to help promote saliva. Sometimes telling people to think about a food. Somebody talked to me about those scratch and sniff stickers, that we used to use. I don't even know if they have them anymore, but smelling things like lemons, limes, etc. Thinking about food, washing your tongue over your teeth can all help to produce saliva from the salivary glands and increase the ability to collect that oral fluid. And again, it's an advantage and a disadvantage, that shorter time frame of window of detection, which completely depends on your own company. I put it in both. So just to compare, this is just in an approximately hair testing, urine testing, oral fluid, and I put breath there. We're not doing a lot of breath testing in Canada right now, but I do put it there because it is a testing that people are asking about and hearing about. Generally speaking, from a THC perspective, oral fluid, depending on where your cutoff is put, you are detecting oral fluid anywhere from a few hours up to about 24 hours. We'll talk a little more about that in a moment. Urine is obviously days to weeks, and hair is usually months, depending on how long you collect. And then you can sort of see in comparison to impairment. So urine testing, really for many, many, many years has been considered the gold standard, but the issues with it are tampering, adulteration, substitution. Adulteration, adding something to the sample; substitution, bringing in a fake sample or somebody else's sample; and dilution is the other thing. So what does that mean? When your urine has a lot of water content, meaning that you drank a lot of water, everything in the urine is lowered, and that includes the quantitative levels of substances. So sometimes by drinking an inordinate amount of water, people attempt to push the levels of the substances below the cutoff level. And so you can end up with this, what we call negative dilute, meaning the sample is so dilute, there's lots of water content in it because they drank so much water, and that pushed the level of the substance below the cutoff level. And that obviously is a form of, I will say it can be a form of tampering if it's done on purpose. There are many people who drink a lot of water, and so they always have sort of samples that are slightly dilute. But certainly that can happen. And then the other thing is, especially for THC, it does not confirm recent use. So these are just some examples. I like to show these and talk a little bit about it, about what people are actually using when it comes to tampering with urine. And if you don't think it's happening in your workplace, I will tell you to think twice, because it really is. People bring in fake urine. Where there's a will, there's a way. Let me tell you, there's a market often in workplaces or sites, etc., for ways to tamper. And so this is just some of the things that people will try. It's obviously harder with oral fluid. So this is the standard testing panel. It is the same for urine as it is for oral fluid. If you're all doing drug testing, you probably are familiar with this. Generally cocaine, cannabis, opiates, amphetamine group, and PCP. But similar to urine, for non-DOT, in oral fluid, you can add in other substances. So we have the ability to test for many other substances. I've just named a few of the more common ones: fentanyl, methadone, buprenorphine, which is Suboxone. There's not a lot of people testing for that, but I just put it there: benzodiazepines and barbiturates. So in oral fluid, we have the same ability with the same testing panels as we do in urine. So, those would be sort of equal. I want to talk a little bit about THC cutoff levels. Now, from a DOT perspective, the cutoff levels are set, meaning your only option, if you are DOT and in 2025 or later going to be doing oral fluid testing from a THC perspective, is a screen at 4 and confirm at 2. But if you are non-DOT, then you have 3 options right now. The 2 most common are screen at 4, confirm at 2, screen at 10, confirm at 10, and a newer one that is out there, which is not being used as often, is screen at 10, confirm at 5. So SAMHSA, that's the substance abuse and mental health. So they basically are the ones who set out the DOT regulations. That's the 4 and 2. That's where they speak to it. Canadian model is another model or guideline with respect. They do mention oral fluid testing. They right now speak to a screen of 4 and a confirmation of 2. The CNSC is the nuclear regulations for Canada. They, in their regulations at the moment, again, speak with screen of 10 and confirm at 5. That's where that new one came in. So why does it matter? Why do we have all these different cutoffs? How do you know what to use and when? And what I will tell you is that it is a very individual decision. So I think we talked about this, so I'm just going to move on to the next one. Hang on, I think this is what I'm looking for. Yes, yes, okay, this is what I'm looking for. So it is an individual decision, and what I will tell you is this: there is no test in urine, in oral fluid, one will argue even in blood, or in hair, or in anything else, that is a definitive impairment test. Oral fluid is the best test for determining the time frame of detection. We use that time frame of detection to determine a risk of impairment. So depending on where your company falls and what you want to see in your company with respect to the risk and the balance of risk and one's ability to use a legal substance, you know, when you balance all that out is where you can end up landing. So just to kind of show you, and I put 25 nanograms per mil there, not because that's a common cutoff, but when we talk a little bit about POCT testing, I just want you to see where we're at, because many of the point of collection oral fluid cutoffs are somewhere between 20 and 50. So I just put 25 in there just to sort of show. But in all of these, you will see a darker level, and then a lighter kind of shaded one. So for example, let's take 2 nanograms per mil. For the most part, it will test positive for up to 24 hours. That does not mean that everybody will test at 2 or above for a whole 24 hours. Some people may be much shorter period of time frame, but there are others that will be a longer period, a period that it will detect it. And those people are the ones who use chronically, frequently, daily. So, or heavy use or high dose use, we think lasts a little bit longer. So that shaded area gives you kind of the, maybe the few that, not the few, but the smaller percentage of people who are very, very heavy users or high dose THC who can test positive for longer than what we call the standard. And this kind of just gives you that time range, just to know. So using that is really then where you want to go with respect to which cutoff you're going to choose. I can tell you the pros and cons of all, but I can't make that decision for you. It is really a company specific decision based on your balance of safety risks and one's personal choice to use a substance outside of work and how long you want that to be based on impairment and risks, et cetera, the type of work, the type of positions, the type of safety sensitive, how, you know, safety sensitive it is. I always say safety sensitive does not have one meaning. So there are different sort of levels, I will say, of how safety sensitive a position or duties in a role may be. And so, you know, there are some companies that and policies that speak to different positions having different requirements with respect to use of cannabis. So, you know, 12 hours, 24 hours, 28 days. And sometimes you'll break it down into work type, you know, what types of positions, et cetera. So you can use this to decide based on the length that you want to see with how you want to detect it. So there are a number of factors that really play a role when we are determining how long it's going to last. As you can see, I kind of gave a range there. When we look at studies, obviously the cutoff level makes a difference of how long you're going to detect it for, as we talked about, but sometimes it's also the actual device. So the device that we are using right now in Canada is only one, and that is the QuantaSol device. So when we look at studies that look at time frame of detection, it's important to look at the ones that look at that particular device, because we're going to get slightly different time frames with slightly different devices. Just their ability to extract the THC and get it off of the swab and into the test, et cetera. So the route of administration of cannabis also plays a role. So when you smoke cannabis or vaporize cannabis, you get much more THC in the mouth. When we are doing oral fluid swabs, we are detecting the remnants of THC in the mouth after you use it. So if you rub THC onto your arm and it gets absorbed, you are not going to see it in the oral fluid. The only detection of THC that we are seeing in the oral fluid is anything that you put in your mouth or your nose. So if it's a cannabis spray through the nose, that still seeps into the mouth and it will test positive. If you're smoking, if you're vaporizing, if you're ingesting, whether it's an edible or an oil, that's all in your mouth. And we're literally picking up the remnants that stay in the mouth until they are absorbed or spit out or swallowed, etc. And so we have different amounts that kind of get stuck in the mouth based on whether you eat it, you use an oil, or you smoke it. And smoking has the higher levels, so it will last a little bit longer than with ingestion. And the amount of THC also plays a role. So how much THC are you having, meaning how, what is the strength of the THC? In Canada, with legalized cannabis, you can purchase dried cannabis to smoke up to 30%, but you can also purchase 30% THC, but you can also purchase concentrates that are 60 to 90% THC, very, 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 very high doses of THC. And the more THC in the mouth, the higher the levels are going to be in the oral fluid, and the longer they're likely going to stay in the oral fluid. So all of these play a role. There is a lot of talk as well on the difference in how long something stays in the mouth for an occasional user, maybe once a week or a couple times a month. They may use some cannabis on a Saturday night, let's say, or whatever that may be, or a frequent user who is using more often, weekly, daily, or on most days. The weekly, daily, on most day users tend to continually always have a little bit of THC left in their oral cavity before the next time they use. They are also better able to extract the THC when they're smoking it or vaporizing it, and their levels can sometimes be a little bit higher just with the way they're taking in, we call it smoking topography, so how you are smoking it. How long you hold it for, the strength of taking it in, etc. So it makes a difference. This is a fancy little chart that I got from a study, which I put at the bottom there, but really this is just showing you the difference between chronic in the dark black and occasional users in the light gray. And you can see that chronic users will continue to test positive at very low levels for a longer period of time than the occasional users. The rest of it is pretty similar though. And so the pattern is similar. It's just that we seem to see these chronic users hovering in and around very, very, very low levels for a little bit longer. This is just another fancy curve here to show you that for the most part, when you smoke and vaporize, what we are seeing is very high levels of THC at the beginning, but within 3 hours in the oral fluid, it tends to really significantly decrease by about 95%. And so then it takes a little longer to come out. So this is those first 3 hours with high levels coming out quickly, and then it'll hover a little bit longer and continually decrease, but on a much slower rate than in the first 3 hours. So once again, as I was saying before, when you're using a confirmation cutoff of 2, we're picking it up on average for up to 24 hours. But there are studies that show that chronic, heavy, frequent daily users of cannabis, these are very heavy users in these studies, will continue to test positive beyond 24 hours, generally in and around 30, 32 hours, depending on the study. But when we look at these studies, these are very heavy users. So average of 10 joints a day, average of smoking for the last 10 years. Now, I don't know the strength of those 10 joints, so I can't tell you the amount of THC necessarily. But this is not the, I smoke a couple times a week. This is very chronically heavy, etc. For the most part, it is understood that when you use a cutoff level of 2 nanograms per mil, it's in and around 24 hours, but be careful in Canada because of the concentrates, because they are such high dose, and we don't have a lot of oral fluid studies on that, that it is possible that using a concentrate, is equal, I don't know, I'm just saying, perhaps to 10 joints a day. And so if you're using a little bit of concentrate every night or every day, you may continue to test positive for longer than that period of time. And we talked about the fact that occasional users will be lower. In comparison, when we look at 10 nanograms per mil, the average is approximately 12 hours, up to 12 hours. Some people may be 4 or 6 or 8 hours. And again, those same heavy frequent cannabis users, again, very, very, very heavy, 10 joints a day, 10 plus years, can test positive at 10 or above for much longer. Some are 14 hours, some are 16 hours, so I just want to put that out there because it is not a given that everybody by 12 hours is going to test below 10. That is the time frame, though. And again, from an occasional user, I use a couple times a week, I use a couple times a month. We're not expecting it to be longer than 12 hours. So as I said, I do want to talk a little bit about cocaine, and I'm just mindful of the time, but I think we're still okay. The advantage of cocaine in oral fluid. So, I often find in Canada that there's a lot of people who just want to do oral fluid testing for THC. So for example, they may do a urine POCT, and we'll talk about POCT in a moment. And if that's non-negative for THC, they will do an oral fluid swab for THC and send that to the lab for confirmation. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But what I will say is that the advantage of oral fluid is not only for THC. Our second most common positive test, most of them are THC, but our second most common is cocaine. And I often get the question when I have a urine positive for cocaine, well, when did they use? Were they impaired at work? What's the risk? And while I can tell you that any cocaine use can have prolonged effects, it can be hours, it can be days, I can't tell you when they would have used, other than to say it was in 3 to 5 days before. But if they were a heavy user or lots of cocaine over the weekend, maybe they had a binge use over the weekend, we can see it lasting for even longer. But when we do oral fluid testing for cocaine, we are testing for cocaine and for the metabolite benzoylecgonine. Cocaine itself, now different than THC, when we're testing cocaine, we are seeing the remnants from when you would smoke it if you're smoking crack cocaine or snort it if you're doing lines of cocaine. We would see those remnants in the mouth. But we also were seeing it cross from the blood to the oral cavity. We don't see that with THC for various reasons, but we see it with cocaine. And so what we see in the oral fluid reflects what is in the blood. Cocaine itself does not stay in our system for very long. It gets broken down to the metabolite. So when you see actual cocaine in the oral fluid, they didn't use 5 days ago or 3 days ago. They used much more recently. And so then what we can say is with very recent use of cocaine, there's a much higher risk of impairment. It just gives us much more information. And if we're only seeing the metabolite, that's equivalent to the urine, because in the urine, we're testing for the metabolite as well. So it just gives us a better indication. And the timelines, as I said, are similar to blood. So from a blood perspective with cocaine, that would be, that's what the police use from a impairment perspective. And so, it just provides much more information. So if you are using oral fluid testing, you have some decisions. So, if you're using POCT, are you using urine or using oral fluid? If you're using oral fluid, are you sending them all to the lab? Or are you only sending the non-negative to the lab? Are you testing for a full panel? Are you only doing THC? You have a whole bunch of options here. And then again, for THC, it is the decision of what is the cutoff going to be? How long do you want to be able to detect THC? And again, I can tell you all the reasons to use, a confirmation of 2, all the reasons to do a confirmation of 10 or a confirmation of 5, but that ultimate decision on how to balance that risk is up to the company, knowing sort of the employees, the situation, the risks, the hazards in the workplace. So that is something to consider and talk about, and certainly something we can provide you with more information about for you to then make that decision. So the most important thing that I want to tell everybody, because I get asked this all the time, can you tell me if they were definitively impaired? What is their level of impairment? When did they use it? How much did they use? By what route did they use? So I cannot answer most of those questions. I can't tell you with 100% certainty whether a person was impaired without doing an impairment examination on them at that moment, and we don't do that. So don't often do that. So I cannot tell you from any drug test how much they used, how frequently they use it, what their history of use is. I can tell you a time frame of use, but I can't say to you, well, if the level is this, that means they must have used 5.5 hours before. We can't, it's different than alcohol. I can give you a time frame, but not a specific time. Nor can I tell you whether they injected it, whether they smoked it, whether they snorted it. We can't really tell any of that. But what we can talk about is the risk in the workplace, fitness for duty, impairment risk, likelihood of impairment, and the time frame that that particular test will detect. In the last couple of minutes, I do want to talk about POCT testing. So POCT testing is that on-site immediate test, immediate results right away. And when we say immediate results, we mean, is it negative, meaning nothing in the sample, or is it non-negative, which means the screen has picked something up? We don't call a POCT test positive because we need it to go to the lab to confirm. So we just say it's not negative, non-negative. It is not a negative test, but we need to send it to the lab to confirm it. So those are the terminology that we like to use. You know, why does somebody use a POCT test? Now, just to be very clear, DOT does not allow POCT testing, nor will they. So this conversation, if you are strictly DOT, you can tune out because you can't do this anyways. But for non-DOT, it is an option. Why do people use it? Because they want immediate answers to make an immediate decision. Again, I would say that that would be a temporary immediate decision because we don't want to base anything necessarily on a screening result if it is non-negative. But for the most part, when we're doing drug testing, the vast majority of tests are negative. And so for many companies, they want to know that it's negative so that they can just carry on as usual, potentially. And so that's why people do POCT testing. And then the decision is, do you do urine or oral fluid? So DriverCheck has put out a white paper, which is sort of an overview of oral fluid POCT testing. That, as far as I am aware, and Jonathan can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that you all are getting a copy of that. And so I'm not going to talk in detail about all the different POCT oral fluid. I'm going to talk in generalities about it because I get asked about this more often than anything else. You know, when you use urine POCT testing and you're testing that for THC, many people in Canada use cannabis. You know, I would say, you know, anywhere, the studies show somewhere about 25 to 35% of individuals have used cannabis in the last year. THC metabolite in the urine, which is what is tested for, can stay positive days to weeks. So you're going to have a number of people who may have used 3 weeks ago and may test non-negative on a urine, but if you were to do an oral fluid swab and that is what you're basing your decisions on, and you send it to the lab, could be negative. And so I have lots of people saying, well, I want to do POCT, but I want to line that up with the same thing that I'm using for testing in the lab, meaning oral fluid. So, you know, I will say that oral fluid testing for POCT has come a long way. They are good. Most of them are really good, but not yet, many of them, quite as accurate as urine. Now, what does that mean? So at lower cutoff levels, closer to where we screen it at the lab, it is very hard for most of these oral fluid POCTs to extract the THC and detect it at those low levels. Some are better than others. But at the very low levels, they're not great. And so many of the oral fluid devices have a cutoff level for THC in their POCT test that is significantly higher than what we are screening for at the lab. which means that if you have a negative test and you're screening it and the POCT is 50 nanograms per mil, but your lab, when you send it away to lab, will be 10 or 4, you can sort of see that there'll be a whole bunch of people there that would test negative, but their levels in theory could be much higher than what your set cutoff level is in your policy or what you're utilizing. So it's just something to be aware of. They're great when there's a lot of THC. They're just not great when there's just a little bit of THC. They're pretty good for most of the other substances, though, I will say, but the biggest challenge is that they don't all have, many of them don't have the same cutoff levels that we're using at the lab. With urine POCT, we match up those screening cutoff levels on the urine POCT with what we would use at the lab for urine. But the same thing isn't always true for all of the POCTs out there. So if you are using oral fluid POCT, just be aware of what the cutoff levels are in relation to what the lab would be when you send them to the lab. Just important to kind of understand that. So when you're trying to kind of figure out, what do I do now? What are my options? Do I use urine? Do I use oral fluid? What cutoff level do I use for oral fluid? Do I use POCT? Do I use urine? Do I use oral fluid? All of those questions out there, you know, it is what I always say is that you need to be aware of what questions you want answered. If you say to me, I just want to know if they've ever used a drug, and that's important to you, and you just, doesn't matter whether they used it a day ago, a week ago, or a month ago, you know, then you may choose one test. If you say, well, I want to know if they used in the last 8 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, whatever that may be, then you may need a different kind of test. But that's really what it comes down to, is what are your questions that you want answered from your drug test? And again, it's not, you know, it's not the only thing to consider, it's everything else as well. But it's putting everything together with what questions you have that you want answered to determine which test you should be using, and you know, and which cutoff levels, and whether it's urine for some, oral fluid for others, etc.